The Continental Blockade, Napoleon's ambitious attempt to crush Britain economically, is a fascinating case of how economic warfare can shape the fate of nations. Conceived as a way to weaken Britain's financial power and cut off its trade, the blockade ultimately became a catalyst for Napoleon's own downfall. Spanning from 1806 to 1814, the blockade not only impacted Britain, but also shook the foundations of Europe as various countries were forced to choose sides and grapple with the consequences. Napoleon's grand ambition. Napoleon Bonaparte, the French emperor, was determined to bring Britain to its knees. At the time, Britain was a dominant force on the world stage, not because of its land army, which was relatively small, but because of its formidable navy and its vast trade network. While Napoleon's France ruled over much of continental Europe, Britain managed to persistently elude his grasp, shielded by the waters of the English Channel and the might of the Royal Navy. In 1706, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree, which marked the formal beginning of the Continental Blockade. The decree prohibited French allies and territories from trading with Britain, effectively initiating a boycott on British goods. Napoleon's vision was to cut Britain off from European markets, crippling its economy and forcing it into submission. This tactic was not only aimed at Britain's economy, but also at its allies and trading partners. Napoleon's plan involved pressuring other European powers into compliance, effectively isolating Britain. The impact of the blockade. At first, the blockade appeared to have some effect. Britain's economy did suffer, and the value of the British pound dropped significantly in the initial stages. The supply of essential goods, especially those used by the Royal Navy, became scarce. For instance, Britain relied heavily on imports of Baltic timber, hemp, and tar for shipbuilding and maintenance. With access to these resources cut off, Britain faced real challenges. The blockade also had some unforeseen effects within France. The scarcity of goods imported from Britain and its colonies drove innovation and changes in French industry. When sugarcane imports dwindled, the French began producing beet sugar domestically, spurring a new agricultural industry. Napoleon even offered rewards to encourage the cultivation of beets, which had a lasting impact on French agriculture. The strain on Europe. However, the Continental Blockade did not just affect Britain and France. It placed a tremendous burden on the rest of Europe as well. Napoleon demanded strict compliance from his allies and subjected any who defied him to harsh consequences. Countries that relied on British trade, such as Russia and Spain, found themselves in difficult positions. Russia, in particular, had long-standing trade ties with Britain and suffered greatly as a result of the blockade. By 1810, the Russian ruble had plummeted in value, and the country faced severe economic strain. As the years passed, various European nations began to chafe under the restrictions imposed by Napoleon. Smuggling became rampant, with merchants seeking ways to trade with Britain despite the risks. In some cases, even countries that were supposed to enforce the blockade turned a blind eye to these activities. Russia, for example, allowed significant amounts of smuggling, particularly along the border. This tacit approval of smuggling gradually eroded the effectiveness of the blockade. The breaking point, Russia's defiance. By 1812, tensions between France and Russia had reached a breaking point. The blockade had strained relations, and Tsar Alexander I decided to abandon the embargo. He began trading with Britain again, openly defying Napoleon. This act of defiance was one of the key triggers for Napoleon's ill-fated invasion of Russia. The Russian campaign was disastrous. Napoleon's forces suffered heavy losses due to the harsh winter and lack of supplies, and by the time he retreated, his army was severely weakened. The failure of the Russian campaign marked a turning point in Napoleon's reign. The defeat emboldened his enemies, and soon after, a coalition of European powers united to overthrow him. The role of smuggling. Despite Napoleon's attempts to enforce the blockade, smuggling continued to undermine it throughout its duration. Coastal regions across Europe, especially in countries like Spain, the Netherlands, and Italy, became hotbeds of illicit trade. Smugglers used covert routes and clever disguises to bypass French patrols and continue trading with Britain. British goods, particularly textiles, were highly sought after, and the profits from smuggling were too tempting for many to resist. In addition to private merchants, entire governments occasionally facilitated smuggling. For instance, the Dutch allowed British ships to trade under false flags, essentially turning a blind eye to the blockade. Even when Napoleon annexed Holland in 1810, smuggling persisted. Attempts to enforce the blockade became increasingly costly and burdensome, draining French resources and eroding Napoleon's control over his empire. The economic realities. One of the primary reasons for the blockade's failure was the economic interdependence of Europe and Britain. Britain was not only a producer, but also a key market for European goods. Many European countries, especially those in the Baltic region, relied on British trade to sustain their economies. The disruption of this trade led to economic hardship, which fueled resentment and resistance. Furthermore, Britain's naval supremacy allowed it to maintain control over key trade routes and continue its overseas commerce. While the blockade impacted British trade with continental Europe, Britain was able to compensate by expanding its trade networks in the Americas and Asia. This adaptability helped Britain weather the economic storm and emerge relatively unscathed. The long-term consequences. The Continental blockade ultimately backfired on Napoleon. The strain it placed on European economies, combined with the widespread smuggling and defiance, weakened his position. By 1814, after a series of defeats, Napoleon was forced into exile on the island of Elba. Although he briefly returned to power in 1815, his final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo marked the end of his rule. In retrospect, the Continental blockade highlights the complexities of economic warfare. Napoleon sought to weaken Britain, but in doing so, he underestimated the resilience of his opponent and overestimated the loyalty of his allies. The blockade exposed the limits of Napoleon's influence and ultimately hastened his downfall. Legacy and lessons. Today, the Continental blockade serves as a cautionary tale about the limitations of economic sanctions and the importance of understanding the interconnectedness of economies. While sanctions can be effective, they often have unintended consequences that can undermine their objectives. For Napoleon, the blockade was an ambitious endeavor that ultimately contributed to his undoing. His vision of a Europe united under French rule was undone not just by armies and battles, but by the enduring power of trade and economic necessity.